Africa does not need saving. Africa needs remembering. There is a sentence that has stayed with me for years. Africa does not need saving. Africa needs remembering. Most conversations about Africa begin with a diagnosis of deficiency. We are told Africa is poor, Africa is corrupt, Africa lacks development, Africa lacks innovation, Africa lacks good governance. But I want to ask a different question. What if Africa's greatest problem is not what it lacks, but what it has forgotten? Because before we ask how to fix Africa, perhaps we should first ask, who was Africa before she was told who she was? That is the question that led me to write Broken Ancestry. History often tells us that Africa was waiting to be discovered, waiting to be educated, waiting to be civilized, waiting to be saved. Yet when we study African history carefully, another picture begins to emerge. Across the continent existed kingdoms, empires, trade routes, universities, systems of justice, agricultural knowledge, architecture, medicine, philosophy, complex spiritual traditions. These societies were not identical to Europe, nor should they have been. Civilization is not measured by imitation. Civilization is measured by coherence. And Africa possessed coherence. Our ancestors understood something that modern society often forgets. Identity is infrastructure. They understood that a civilization is not held together by roads alone. It is held together by memory, by shared values, by common stories, by moral responsibility, by belonging. One of the greatest achievements of colonialism was not simply occupying African land. It was occupying African memory. When people lose memory, they become easier to direct. When people forget who they are, someone else can tell them who they are. When people forget how they govern themselves, they begin believing they have always needed someone else to govern them. That is why colonization did not stop at political control. It reached into language, religion, education, names, music, family structures, history itself, because whoever controls memory eventually influences the future. Many people assume religion is simply about what happens after death. Traditional African spirituality was different. It was deeply connected to life. It shaped governance, marriage, land ownership, justice, environmental stewardship, community responsibility. Religion was not separate from society. Religion was society. Ancestry was not merely about remembering dead relatives. It was a living relationship with those who came before you and a responsibility toward those who would come after you. That way of thinking changes everything. Because once you believe your grandchildren matter as much as your own comfort, you govern differently, you build differently, you think differently. Now let me be clear, remembering does not mean pretending Africa was perfect. It wasn't. There were wars, there were inequalities, there were failures. Like every civilization, remembering is not about romanticizing history. It is about refusing to accept the false idea that Africa began in deficiency. Every civilization has made mistakes, but not every civilization has been taught to hate its own beginning. Today, many Africans can explain European history in remarkable detail. They know Roman emperors, Greek philosophers, British monarchs, American presidents. Yet ask them about the intellectual traditions of Great Zimbabwe, the governance systems of the Ashanti, the philosophical traditions of the Yoruba, the legal structures of the Oromo, the ecological wisdom of countless African communities. Silence. Not because those traditions never existed, but because generations were educated to believe they were unimportant. Memory was interrupted. Sometimes people ask me whether I want Africans to reject Christianity or Islam. No, that is not my argument. My argument is simpler. Any religion that enters Africa should speak to Africans from an African center of gravity. Africans should never surrender authorship of their own civilization. We can embrace universal ideas without abandoning ourselves. The problem is not learning from others. The problem begins when learning becomes replacement, when admiration becomes imitation, when identity becomes borrowed. Because borrowed identities rarely build confident nations. There is another myth that deserves challenging. Many people believe Africa needs rescuers. Foreign governments, foreign charities, foreign experts, foreign investors, foreign solutions. Let me ask you something. If Africa possesses immense natural resources, one of the youngest populations on Earth, remarkable creativity, and extraordinary resilience, why do we still think Africa's greatest resource must always come from somewhere else? Perhaps what Africa needs most is confidence. Confidence rooted in memory, not arrogance. Memory. The confidence that says, we have solved problems before. We have governed before. We have created before. We have traded before. We have innovated before. That confidence changes how a people think. When I say Africa needs remembering, I am talking about psychological freedom. Because political independence without psychological independence is incomplete. You may fly your own flag, but still wait for permission to think. You may govern your own country, but still measure success using someone else's standards. Real freedom begins in the mind. It begins when a civilization trusts itself again. Imagine raising children who know they descend from builders, not victims, thinkers, not merely survivors, innovators, not imitators. Imagine education that teaches African history with the same seriousness it teaches European history. Imagine development guided by African realities rather than imported templates. Imagine leaders accountable not only to elections, but to future generations. That is remembering. Some people will disagree with my conclusions. That is healthy. Civilizations grow through honest debate. My hope is not that everyone agrees with me. My hope is that more Africans begin asking deeper questions. Questions about identity, memory, responsibility, civilization. Because questions begin revolutions long before answers do. Africa does not need pity. Africa does not need another lecture. Africa does not need another slogan. Africa needs something far more powerful. Africa needs memory. Because a people who remember themselves become difficult to manipulate. A people who remember themselves recover confidence. A people who remember themselves begin building institutions that reflect who they are rather than who they were told to become. Remembering is not going backwards. Remembering is carrying forward what should never have been forgotten. That is why I wrote Broken Ancestry. If this conversation has challenged you to think differently about Africa, identity, and civilization, I invite you to continue the journey. You can listen to the audiobook on PayHip or read the ebook on Amazon. The links to both are in the caption below. Thanks for watching. If you loved this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Until next time, keep asking difficult questions and never stop remembering.